So my name is Hannah Kent, and the book that has been chosen that I've written is called Burial Rites. Burial Rites tells the story of a woman called Agnes Magnusdottir who's been convicted of a murder and sent to basically wait out the time until her execution on an isolated farm in the north of Iceland. So the book really takes place in the last 6 months of her life, and it explores her relationships with the priest who's been called in to sort of pray for her and save her soul, and also the family who are sort of forced to look after her and hold her in custody. And then as sort of the execution draws nearer, you find out that perhaps not everything is as it seems. Well, when I was 17 years old, I went to Iceland as an exchange student for about 12 months. And it was during that time as a 17-year-old that I drove through the area, because the story is based on a real life woman, same name. And as I was driving through the north in the first few months of my exchange in this cold rural place, there was this sort of weird landmark. And I remember asking my host parents if anything significant happened there, and they said, oh, that's where the last person in Iceland was executed. And of course, it seemed like an interesting story, and in the 10 years that have sort of passed since, it hasn't really let me go, really. So I've gone back and I've researched her life and drawn a lot from history and from the historical records and done a lot of research into Iceland. And this book, although it's fiction, is basically a closer mirror to what happened as I could make it. So that's the connection as an exchange student. And I also call this book my dark love letter to the country, because it's somewhere that I still continue to go, and it does mean a great deal to me. It's kind of my foster country in some ways, yeah. Doing this research, I think about this particular woman. One thing that I was really struck with very early on was the fact that, two things really. One was that while the men that were involved in the story of the murders and execution were very much present in the historical records, the women, as I think tends to happen of that time, were kind of more in the background. So there's a lot of information missing, particularly about their lives outside of the crime or the events that are being discussed, whereas that wasn't really the case with the men. And the other reason is that what is there tends to be really quite obviously imbued with this kind of the ideologies of the time and the way in which people regarded women. So for instance, in the case of Agnes Magnusdottir, the protagonist of my book, or rather the real life character, she was often in the shadows, but nevertheless always referred to as sort of the Lady Macbeth of this particular situation, the one who was sort of rubbing her fingers together saying, I'm plotting murder. And she was very much represented as a witch and as a bit of the demon character, and not really given any space for ambiguity. And so really the book for me was a way to look at her life outside of the murder and out of the executions, which is really most well known for these days, and try to, in some ways it's still a very contemporary book, even though it's a historical novel, because it's very much a representation of her which is fed by our contemporary understanding of the past and of women back then, and also the societies in which the ways in which they were constrained, the broader context. I don't know, but I think more generally, I think authors and writers are perhaps interested with what's missing. We're drawn to empty spaces, or perhaps lured by questions, and the idea of a story not fully told, I think, is very appealing. Maybe that's it. That's what draws me anyway. I can't speak for the other writers. They might have their own reasons. It's also hugely convenient to also have a story structure there. I'm waiting, but that's it for me.
And how does it feel to be a debutante?
It's a dream come true. It's such a cliche to say that, but it really is. This is something that I've wanted since I was very, very young indeed. So I'm still pinching myself. It feels very surreal, but I'm very, very, very happy.